Hello, I'm Dr. Pierresamaan, and it's great being back with you. We're continuing in this series, and we're towards the end of it. Actually, at the end, we just have a couple more videos to talk about regarding this, but we're in unmasking addiction, and in this category that is probably the most important. You learn about these things, and then what are you going to do about it? Well, this is the doing stuff, and the doing stuff is where change occurs. We're talking about recovery and relapse prevention. This is a category that gets everybody wound up at times, and it's the most important because, when something is wrong, it's important to recognize, okay, that we need change here. Something needs to be done. And when you're ready to do it, then you may need help in getting it done. And that's what recovery and relapse prevention is all about. Last week we spoke about some of the categories of medications, imaging systems, new questionnaires, and new techniques that are going on. We spoke of neuroscience, and this week we're going to be discussing evidence-based practices, they're getting more detailed in this area. We're also going to talk about coerced treatment. We're going to speak about funding and abstinence versus harm reduction, and that's a big one as far as I'm concerned. Evidence-based practices. Well, when you think of that, it's kind of you might say a technical term, evidence-based. What does that mean? Well, how do you know something is going to work unless you do it? And sometimes trial and error. And so you figure out some things work and some things don't. But when there's evidence to back up what you're doing that's saying, oh, here's why this is working and here's why that's not working, now you have a basis of some sort to repeat, to reproduce whatever you're doing that's right and stop doing what you're doing that's wrong. And in order to do that, it's building evidence. It's figuring out, okay, let's look at the items that are working and the items that aren't working and make those adjustments. So what are the best practices in treatment? Should treatment practices be identical to be called treatment program? What kind of evidence is needed and how much? And like anything else, sometimes we go too far with the evidences or the bureaucracy and all that, and we certainly don't want to do that, but there's a balance there, and when we can find that balance, that's a great thing. In Dr. Craig Inaba's 8th edition book called Uppers, Downers, and All-Arounders, and believe me, having a 2nd edition or a 3rd edition is a big deal in sales, but an 8th edition, he's got something going there that's right. He's saying things in his book that are important, and I would encourage you, if you're in the addiction field or any kind of recovery issues that you're concerned about, that you're wanting to learn more about, this is a very good book to have. He writes, there's a greater emphasis on evidence-based practices in treatment and a diminished appreciation of practice-based clinical management. Now, I think one thing he's saying there in that is, okay, well, let's figure out why it works in Florida, but it doesn't work in another state. I won't mention another state because somebody will get upset. So, okay, well, let's figure that out. And well, okay, let's find the evidence to figure it out so we can replicate it over here in these other states. And they come together and they develop all these evidences, the statistics, the programs that are successful and all that, and then they want to replicate it elsewhere. But in focusing a little too much in one area, what happens? The energy is not there in the other area, and so that area of practice-based clinical management in addictions kind of gets put off to the back burner, while this other stuff becomes more pronounced, more focused. And next thing you know, they're going to have to go back to the clinical-based management and say, well, we got to make this better. There's something wrong here. And it kind of bounces back and forth. So it's important to keep a balance, keep the attention in all the important areas. The overall goal of any evidence-based approach is to maximize the likelihood that treatment will consistently produce positive outcomes. There are some programs, and I used to be an instructor for the Net Training Institute in Florida. I'd encourage you to look them up if you're interested in treatment information or even working in that field of addictions. When we're looking at things that are working, we want to be able to say, okay, this is good, let's keep doing it and let's do it elsewhere. And to do that, we collect evidence, we collect information and so on. Back then, we had a wonderful program in Florida called Dunklin Memorial Camp. And that program had an 80% success rate after 2-year recovery for persons coming out of their program. Now that was a 6-month to a year program, and it's a big farm, and they did a wonderful job down there, and they got the state award, governor's award, for being the #1 program in the state. And what made it #1? What brought it to that place that stood out among all the others? Now, I have my reasons, and I'm not going to get into all that, but they had a wonderful program, and they still have a wonderful program. But what made them different from the others, and how can they bring up the others to that same level of success that the Dunklin Memorial Camp achieved? So they started looking into it and started figuring this and that out. And there's certain things that they could add to these other programs in the state and making them better. And then there was other things they couldn't, because Dunklin Memorial Camp is a Christian-based, faith-based recovery program. Certainly that added a lot more to why they had such high recovery rates. Yet you can still replicate many things in these other programs to improve them. And that's the purpose of evidence-based practices. The University of Iowa established the Practice Improvement Collaborative, PIC for short, network to introduce evidence-based addiction services. The PIC is developing plans to ensure that community-based treatment facilities adopt evidence-based practices. So they've got this big, long criteria that they've put together. And here's just a sampling of it. At least one randomized clinical trial has shown this practice to be effective. So there needs to be at least one clinical trial to show this is working, this is good. Replicated effectiveness. They're able to replicate the effectiveness of this particular program at another program, and it's doable. Good accepted outcomes in behavior and effect. Well, the outcomes are turning out well elsewhere, not just in the one place, but elsewhere when they're replicating the particular program. Number 4 is can be used in different regions, different cities, high income and low income areas, urban areas and city areas. It can be replicated. So that's an important criteria. Practice is feasible for groups, third-party payers, training. Third-party payers, basically insurance. Is the insurance going to say, yeah, this is workable? There's high success rate. We'll fund the person going in there. If it's not, if you can't show it, if you can't demonstrate it, you're less likely to get that third-party funding and paying for all of that. Practice is manualized. So these organizations, these treatment facilities, it's important they have a manual. something that's from page 1 to page whatever, saying, here's how we do it, here's what we expect, and here are the steps along the way. And so every day is scheduled, and here's the schedule, and it's all laid out in a manual. And it's well accepted by providers and clients. I've had a lot of clients in the past where they heard from a friend that, oh no, that program wasn't very good, they didn't like it there. And so they're certainly not going to send their friend over to that program. Word of mouth is important. So is it something that when someone leaves the addiction program, do they feel good about it? Do they feel like they've been added to, not taken away from? Do they feel they've been torn down or built up? In the old days of addiction treatment, it was tearing down, because really the theory was these people you need to rebuild them. So you got to take them back to boot camp, you might say, and tear them down and then rebuild them. And so you'd go into a treatment facility and, oh, you were a nothing, you were this, you were that, awful. And they would talk to you that way. The staff would speak to you like you were in basic training in the military, or you're just dirt, you know? And then they would slowly work on building you up. Well, that didn't work very well, and you might have thoughts about why it didn't work very well, but certainly there were a lot of dropouts from those programs within the first week or two, where people just didn't stick around to get torn down like that. And they finally started to get the idea, hey, wait a minute, this isn't working, we got to change something. And then Christian programs, Christian treatment centers began popping up, and they were approaching it in a biblical way, a faith-based way, which is conducive with the 12-step program, because it's a spiritual program. And these treatment centers were popping up, and they were having much higher success rates, and the individuals were staying there longer. And the other organizations began to say, hey, something's working over there, we got to make these changes ourselves. And so they started approaching it in a more humane way, in a way that builds up and doesn't tear down. Number 8 on the characteristics and on the evidence-based of the PIC program of what they're outlining is clear and well-articulated theory. So, it's got to be written out, it's got to be clear, it's got to be understandable. Methods to ensure trust can be evaluated. Good client retention rates, I was just speaking about that a little moment ago. Culturally diverse, anybody can come into the program. It's not just for this group or that group. Can be used by a wide diversity of staff backgrounds and training. If you limit the leadership to a certain group, then they can't relate to everyone in that program. So that leadership needs to be broadened to where it's drawing in the various cultures, the various groups, the various people in the leadership, so they can relate better to the entire population in the program. Coerced treatment is important, and coerced treatment is, what's the word coerced? It's prodded into, it's compelled to do. We could say forced to do. More than 70,000 addicts receive treatment in the 50 states that operate drug court programs. Now, just take a moment. Drug court program, a lot of states don't have drug court programs, or didn't have for a long time. Now most of them have it. And they're finding higher success rates in treatment where they're going through the drug court program. About 137,000 people are in state prisons or jails in the United States on any given day for drug possession, often for possession of small amounts of illegal drugs. And those small amounts may not sound right. It's usually repeated offenses of small amounts is within that figure. Criminal justice system sanctions involuntary court-ordered or coerced treatment by drug courts, mandatory convictions, probation or parole rules, and state or federal laws mandating involuntary treatment. So here the drug court says, okay, you've got a problem. I'm going to give you a choice. You can go to jail for 6 months, or you can go to a treatment program for 6 months. Which do you want? And of course, there's going to be those that are going to say, yeah, sure, I'll go to treatment. And there's going to be a few more who will say, no, I'm going to jail. There's nothing wrong with me. Well, those that go to treatment, generally that helps them, because usually now in the past, and they're changing that more and more because the funding is getting less and less, and we'll talk about that in a moment. When you get what used to get court ordered, well, the state paid for it, the court paid for it, or the federal grants, federal government paid for it, and that allowed someone to stay within that program for a longer period of time. Because believe me, 30-day programs, they don't work. They'll put a pause for a short time, but the recidivism is just within 3 or 4 days, 3 or 4 weeks, they're back at it again. 90-day program is better. 90-day program, still, if it's a more serious drug addiction issue, 90-day program isn't even enough. 6-month program, a year program, much higher rates of maintaining sobriety 2 years or longer. And now with fentanyl, now with the stronger drugs, the synthetic drugs that are occurring, addiction is becoming much tougher to treat, and those programs not only need to be longer, but they need to be more detail-oriented. They're more intense, you might say, in the activity going on there, because the damage of the brain has been so great that it takes longer for healing to occur, and therefore longer to be able to begin the process of changing the thinking, and then the behavior follows that change of thinking, and it takes time to change the behavior. Dismissing or reducing the charges is typical if the dependent meets the treatment requirements. So yeah, but you only lasted 5 months in the 6-month program, and you left without being discharged as completing it. So okay, we're going to give this charge to you, and you're going to jail now for 6 months. And to get out earlier, you're going to have to agree to go back to treatment, or something like that, they might say. So that's a good incentive to stay in the program. In New York, there was a significant reduction in the rate of rearrest, at 33% reduction. Readmission was 45%. The return to prison was 87% reduction compared to inmates who did not participate in drug court. Strong evidence that drug court works. In California, federal costs per drug-related prisoner averaged $11,000. But when drug offenders went through drug court, they didn't repeat, they didn't go back into the system or go back to prisons. The prison costs dropped to $3,000 a year per offender. Researchers and observing similar results in other states as well. maybe not that dramatic, but they're seeing where there are drug courts, their costs of funding is significantly reduced in an overall way of looking at that. Those not integrated into the legal system will have fewer treatment options due to high treatment costs. And basically, that's saying that the costs are going up. You go through the drug court, the state pays for it, the federal government pays for it, or there are grants available to pay for it. Well, now it's affordable and more people are getting help. But unfortunately, those who aren't going through the drug courts, who say, hey, I got a problem, I need help, and they call the local treatment center and say a residential program and say, hey, what's the criteria for getting in? I need help. I don't want to be this way anymore. I've hit my bottom. And they'll say, well, here's the criteria, and it's going to cost you $10,000 a month or $15,000 a month. And, they've spent all their money on drugs. They've lost everything. Now they have to rely on relatives or some other source to pay for that, and that's just not going to happen. So it ends up maybe only a 30-day program where they probably really need a 6-month program at least. That's getting hard now for those folks. More incentives for providers to open complementary treatment plans are needed. So more incentives for people to say, I'd like to start a treatment program in my house, in my apartment building, in the warehouse, in the farmhouse, in the barn. And meet the criteria, of course, for that state's going to require and all that. But those are the cheaper, less costly treatment programs that are more affordable for those who are not going through the drug programs. And unfortunately, even in the drug programs, I've had clients where they went through the court-ordered drug program, or they went to court, the drug court, but the drug court says, well, there's no funding available for you, but we're going to court order you to so-and-so's program. You're going to have to pay for it. Now it loses that effectiveness, doesn't it? And they're seeing more of that because the funding isn't as available as it once was. There's not enough resources to provide addiction treatment. And if there's not enough resources, what's going to happen on the other end? Addiction's going to rise. People are going to stay in their addiction longer. And the longer they stay, the more damaged their brains will deteriorate in such a way that they can't problem solve. And all they do is escape back to what has worked in the past, and that's the drugs, the alcohol, the behavior, whatever it might be. In a 2010 study, there were 46 million addicts in the United States. Well, funding. The addiction crisis is deadlier than ever before. You can't listen to the news without hearing more of these things going on. Overdoses are #1 cause of accidental death in our country alone. According to the CDC, there were over 107,000 fatal overdoses in the U.S. in 2021. That's the highest number of overdose deaths ever recorded in a single year. Our children are dying. Our family, our friends, our neighbors, the young people are being seduced into drug addiction, pornography, gambling, and whatever else at a higher rate than ever before. And what are we doing about it? Yeah, think about it. What is your community doing about it? What is the government doing about it? Doesn't seem like a whole lot's being done other than they're talking, They're saying something needs to be done, and yet they're not stopping the fentanyl from coming into the country. They're not stopping the opiates from coming into the country. They do token raids, and they do little things here and there to look like they're doing something, but there's more behind all this than just drugs and addiction. We can't rely on others to stop this true epidemic that's occurring, this addiction epidemic that's occurring. We have to do the right things ourselves in helping in whatever ways we can, while relying less on the politicians and whoever else to do anything about it. And if that means helping someone more, encouraging them more, helping them find a treatment program that's affordable, or helping to find funding to pay for someone to go into treatment, whatever we can do, we've got to do it ourselves. We can't rely on our leadership to do it for us. Only 1 in 10 people who need treatment get treatment, let alone get high quality care based on scientific evidence. This category is very important because I hear this all the time. And you know, they have a term in addiction called stinking thinking. Stinking thinking is basically making those excuses to keep drugging, keep the addiction going, reasoning or justifying why it's okay. And absence versus harm reduction is one of those areas. Abstinence-based recovery is no use, while harm reduction is reducing use gradually, if necessary, adding controlled drugs. For example, replacing heroin with methadone, a more potent opiate with a less strong. I've mentioned this before, but the methadone clinics, when they first started, they were only supposed to be giving methadone for 90 days, and within that 90-day period, they would start reducing. So at the end of the 90 days, they were off the drug completely. And slowly they started continuing the methadone for months and years, and we would start complaining about it to the state, and at first the state would do something about it, and then they just didn't do anything about it. And now you got people who've been on methadone. Well, I'm not an addict anymore. I'm on methadone. Well, methadone is a drug. You're still addicted because you're not off the methadone. You're no longer addicted if you get off the methadone and you've been off it for a while. And I probably shouldn't even say no longer addicted, because some say in the field, once an addict, always an addict, basically saying, hey, you got the proclivity of doing it again. It doesn't just leave the brain to where you can say no to it and play with it, and it's not going to reoccur. Most addiction counselors believe that users who cross the line and engage in uncontrolled drug use or compulsions can easily refuse the first drink, the first shot, the first pornography picture, or gambling, but they can't refuse the second. Yeah, that's very true. Chemical addiction is the #1 health and social problem worldwide, despite being one of the most treatable problems. Successful participation in treatment programs results in more extended abstinence, healthier minds and bodies, social improvements, communities are improved, and the activities working in the community, volunteering and so on, you see more of that, and psychological benefits for participants. They're thinking better, they're reasoning better, they're coming out of the basement of the brain that we've spoken of many times in the past, and they're now residing in the upper room of the brain where your good thinking, reasoning is located, where those good areas of problem solving are located in the top half of your brain. That's where we want to reside all the time. We want to bounce out of the basement. We don't want to stay in addiction. If you stay in addiction, you're staying in the basement of the brain much longer, which is growing the basement of the brain. Actually, in brain matter, it grows down there, gets heavier down there because it's drawing all the nutrients down there. Well, that reminds me of that first biblical step. We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol or addiction. Our lives were beyond our control. A biblical step, number one, tells us we must acknowledge our inability to heal ourselves and admit we need a Savior. Say that louder. The Bible tells us in the Remedy Bible translation, Jesus heard what they said and replied, "Those who believe they're healthy don't go to the doctor. Only the sick do. I cannot help those who believe they're already right with God, but only those who know they're sick with sin." Do you know you're sick with sin or addiction or foul language or lying or stealing or whatever it might be? You know, sin basically is just something that you do that's harmful. It's going to be harmful to you or to someone else in the present or in the future. And God says, hey, don't do these things because it's going to harm you. It's going to harm others. Don't be afraid of that word sin. Be afraid of the results of sin because it damages the brain. That damages you, your family, and everything you touch. Well, may your troubles be more minor, blessings more, and happiness come through your door. We'll be talking about this some more next time. God bless.